Developing creator talent is an exciting opportunity for a lot of business folks like me who are not as talented, but we understand how to run the business, and we can help a lot of creators offload their responsibilities when it comes to things that are boring and focus more on being the actual creators. One agency taught us a lesson this year about what not to do, and I would like to review the leaked deck to see what kind of things that it did right when in terms of communication and planning and where it all went wrong. Of course, we're talking about VShojo. If you're not familiar, essentially VShojo was a Japanese/American based talent agency management company that primarily focused on VTubers, hence the V in the VShojo. One of those things that they were popular for is that they had some of the most popular and top talent when it came to VTuber streaming community. The downside that we learned very quickly this year is that it all crumbled to pieces very fast. It was kind of like going up, and went off the cliff. And this deck kind of like sheds a light on some of the things, plus I will incorporate some of the feedback that some of those creators close to the founding team shared that I think are the important considerations. Because as any story, there are two sides to every coin. First and foremost, if you're not familiar with the management companies, I have an entire video about those, but primarily what you need to focus on, those are the companies that help creators take their creative business to the whole nother level by not only attracting, say, the brand deals, but also thinking about what are the other opportunities for us to leverage that creator brand to grow the revenue streams for it. And so that's what VShojo focused on. And it was founded by Justin Ignacio. Interesting background. I'm not going to go through all of this because it's essentially his biography and why kind of like he's validating his presence at the helm of this company, the fact that he was part of the community, one of the first hires at Twitch, and really kind of like deeply understood this niche. Again, if you're curious, check it out. I'm going to skip through because I'm very curious to talk about the business side of things. When it comes to structuring the business, here's basically the leadership team, right? He kind of like calls out his chief of staff, who has a lot of experience in gaming and kind of like working with major brands out there, as well as he has Alex, who clearly helps him kind of like both manage the talent, but also someone who understands licensing and technical side of things and kind of like can go and work some of those deals. They obviously call out the talent managers out there who are essentially going and supporting the talent on a day-to-day basis. 10 talent managers seemed like a lot considering the fact that they currently, or at the point when the whole thing went down, and they had about, I think, 12 creators on staff. So it's almost 1-to-1 ratio, which seems to be a little bit inefficient. We're going to see that actually in some of the metrics because at the end of this deck, they do have the actual performance metrics for this company. And they obviously talk about the fact that they're a global company, which is absolutely fine right now, especially considering the fact that they have talent in both Japan and the United States. One glaring thing that really stood out to me, and we'll see it kind of like echoing down the line, there isn't necessarily a person, although Eric Garvey is kind of like called out as someone who is responsible for operational efficiency. It doesn't seem like they had someone with a very direct experience in managing this kind of teams on these kind of projects, which again, something that I think will echo in the history and what went down with this company. In terms of like interesting things for you to also get a context for why VShojo was so popular and kind of like what they were able to achieve, by signing the right talent and giving them the right opportunities, they managed to do a lot of things, right? They kind of like call out the fact that they had a participation with the Smite, which is a game, and they had the skins of the VShojo talent in Smite, which clearly had some revenue. Blacked out size tells me it's probably in tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's probably about as much, because I'm also comparing to, like, you know, when you look at something like 312,000, that's width-wise is probably about as much. So it's a six-figure number. Where here we're talking about, you know, 7, maybe even 8-figure number right over here, because they're talking about Iron Mouse, which was their top talent, right? And Iron Mouse was also like the creator of the year at the Game Awards back in 2023. And that clearly tells you about the size of, you know, the business that they were managing. Because, and again, Twitch subscriptions, I think, went from like $5, $8, right, $10, and there's a split that Twitch takes. But we're talking about, as I said, at least, I think, a 7-figure number. So we're talking about Iron Mouse clearing $1 million plus at least every month, but it's on the very conservative side of things, right? And it gives you kind of like the understanding of the type of business that they were dealing with. Again, Iron Mouse being the top creator on their roster, obviously that's kind of like, you know, probably the peak and a little bit of an outlier, but still there are 11 other creators who were decently successful and popular as well. So one of those interesting things that they've done very well is, I think, expanding the brand outside of Japan. And this is one of those important things that I think worked pretty well for them, is that they had that experience of managing the audiences and understanding what kind of like drives the market, both for the Japanese culture, but also for the American culture. And they managed to give a lot of interesting opportunities. You know, they're talking about applications because they were hiring the talent to voice over some of the Japanese talent in English. Again, thinking very well about the fact that for you to really set the foundation and have a representation in the US market, you need to be able to not just dub into English, but actually have someone as an English speaker in the market who able to kind of like reflect some of the things that very likely came from the translations of anime for the American culture, that for someone who grew up with that kind of, side of the world, consuming that kind of content, they have certain expectations for how the characters would speak and perform. So they manage to reflect some of those things, right? And I think that's a smart move. Like Mr. Beast have done something similar when he was translating his videos into local languages. He hired local people to the market who understand the vocabulary, who understand the slang, who can not only directly translate, but actually add some flair to make it sound more like a native speaker talking to another native speaker. So important things and some cultural things, which again, cosplaying and all those things, it's a great thing, it's validation, but it's not necessarily something as interesting for me from the business perspective. From interesting kind of like positioning, and they talk a little bit about, right, some of the things I just mentioned, they do have some, presence, and obviously they're calling like industry defining contracts. I don't know what makes it industry defining, but it's interesting to hear about the fact that they are thinking about how VTubers can kind of like gradually progress from maybe just starting out on their own to becoming part of the VShojo. As I've mentioned, they have both Japanese and English leadership, which is good. That's what I've kind of like alluded to, with the fact that they managed to control for both of those, and tech supremacy, which is absolutely fine. VTuber technology is actually important. For those of you who don't know, it's frequently is not just animated characters speaking. In many cases, they do kind of like a mocap. If you've seen like, pick any Marvel movie and you have CGI character in it, or Pirates of the Caribbean back in the day, right? And they have this famous VFX work for the Davy Jones. You have someone actually playing out what you see on screen, and there's an engine in between the actor and the character that helps translate and make the character follow those behaviors, while simultaneously kind of like allowing the person behind the scenes act out and not really worried about hiring a team of 10 animators to make it work. Code Miko is a popular kind of like example. Code Miko has amazing tech that she's developing herself. I made an entire video about this creator, so check it out. The tech is really cool. So it makes sense that they have some tech know-how that allows them to support a lot of the creators on their roster. From the perspective of like identity, again, up until that point, and probably like me, many of you were not as familiar, which is absolutely fine, but there was a big representation. Again, in the cosplaying scene, in the, those like custom cars competitions alone, like you can kind of get a vibe that yes, there was a certain audience that was really into this talent pool. And I believe them that they had a strong brand identity. It was very positive brand identity as well, up until it was not. Talent first approach is very ironic to read at this point, which again, there's some commentary I learned later on, which kind of like puts it in perspective. But if you read the kind of like the discussions around VShojo right now, the whole conversation is about how they screwed over the talent and didn't pay them for the deals that they owe them, which essentially created the collapse, right? And the big one was Iron Mouse was expecting the payments. I think even for the charity, that was the worst part, is that there was for the charity at first, but then also to the talent themselves. And essentially, VShojo ran out of money, didn't have money to pay on time, and that kind of like collapsed the entire pyramid because of the fact that the rest of the talent were not getting paid as well, which again, we'll talk about. And there is truth that one of the best things that management teams can do is provide some sort of like IP sponsorship growth, right? Management team, as I mentioned earlier, compared to the agency, their job is not only to go and acquire brand deals, which is agencies just focus on, or just agents, right? Management team should be thinking about, hey, is there an opportunity for us? Like in this case, I think just as a visual, they show like, PC cases. Can we go and partner with a PC case manufacturer and have a branding deal where they use the VShojo assets and we get a cut from every PC case sold, right? Like those are the kind of things that management teams should be thinking about, executing and essentially running by their talent, so that the talent can say yes or no depending on whether they think that fits their brand. So that's something that they've attempted to do based on the financials. They talk about it as if it happened, but financials will tell you a little bit of a different story. And again, they talk about sponsorships, which they already had with the G Fuel. Who doesn't among the top creators have a sponsorship with the G Fuel? It probably speaks more about G Fuel's awareness of the market rather than their ability to acquire deals. But again, that's me just speculating. They had some merchandising, which again, great. They've released some merch. They made some decent money. 1.5 million is nothing to sneeze at, but I think based on how they break it out, it's across all of the creators. Probably 1.2 million of it was driven by Iron Mouse, and the rest of it was driven by other creators. Again, I'm speculating with all due respect to other creators on their roster. And IP licensing, again, something that they're planning on to do more of in 2025. A lot of these financials that you see are for 2024. An interesting thing, like I actually find it very generous that they were planning to do 80-20 split with their talent. I think it's very fair. It also represents the fact that because of this percentage, what it tells me is that they needed to drive the talent acquisition. Because if you're giving 80% away of the revenue and 20% is what you keep, you either A, have a very low cost of running the business, which is not the case that you'll see again in financial. I keep teasing that. But B, you anticipate you're just going to have such a volume of those deals that you'll be able to make up on the volume, that lower split that you're taking, which again, not a bad approach on paper. I actually really respect it because there will be companies out there that will reverse it and will only give 20% to their talent and keep 80% to themselves. So spirit of it was very positive. This slide affirms this, right? You can see how they are thinking about, hey, there's like high profile signing, obviously, right? We spoke about someone like Iron Mouse, but scaling the roster from, 12. So I was correct. I thought it was about 1,000 talents that I have to 30 to 40. Right, which is okay, great. That's how you're planning to make up the difference, I guess. And again, continue to attract other creators and potentially hiring industry veterans to join your roster. Because arguably for the management companies like theirs, once you have that muscle to do merchandising, IP, brand deals, revenue expansion, hypothetically, you should be able to just ingest the new creator, put them on the same rails, and kind of like give them all those opportunities much quicker than you would have if you would have developed them from scratch from the very beginning. It doesn't mean that you're going to just go and like slap their name on the same product. It just means that you have the pipeline to develop the product, you have a pipeline to negotiate deals, you have a pipeline to do IP licensing. That's what I mean by that. And again, they talk about the fact that kind of like they'll continue going through both vice versa kind of like expansion, right, of their know-how. So basically thinking about, okay, how are they going to go and penetrate the Japanese market with the talent outside of Japan, and again, what they've done before, expanding the Japanese talent over to the other parts of the world. So it's kind of like interesting way of doing it in the sense that as long as you have the talent to do so and you have the expertise, I don't see why not. Deal making and product like productions, tariffs, local laws can be very different. So from the revenue expansion perspective, especially if you have a smaller team, I would probably say pick a region, right? And say like if you're really focused on doing revenue expansion in North America, just focus on that and kind of like take people from Japan to North America or establish North American native creators and kind of like give them that opportunity. Doing both, again, probably was part of the reason what we'll see in the financials, but I am always wary of the fact that when the companies start expanding globally a little bit too early before they set up really firm foundation locally in whatever their geography or the primary region that they're focused on are. And then from then on out, they're talking about outbound sales activation, which is again my point on G Fuel. I'm pretty sure G Fuel reached out to them, not them reaching out to G Fuel, but they kind of like talk about the fact that they want to make sure that they start doing a lot more outbound work to kind of like attract the brand deals, right? High value sponsorships, kind of like bringing other big brands, licensing opportunities. We spoke about licensing their IP to other different brands, other companies, doing collabs, things of that nature. Merchandising optimization. They talk about bringing the merchandising efforts internally. I have a lot of issues with that. Primarily because if we come back to the talent page, I'm going to flip it because there were only like 3 people. You already remember by now. I question bringing in the merchandising internally without having a person who actually really understands the merchandising to begin with. This is one of those things that I always try to talk creators and the management companies out of, primarily because if you don't have an expertise in that industry, as much as it can be attractive, as much as you can look at some of those other brands and say like, oh, XYZ brand made like millions of dollars on the merchandising and they own it internally, so they distribute, they manufacture, they support, they do all of those things. This is awesome. Their margins are so high. They make a couple of extra $1 million by keeping it internally. Fair point. The operational complexity in managing all of this requires so much expertise and knowledge that even me, like as operational guy, like I can probably take that kind of organization to a certain level just because I inherently understand what it takes to take a product from like an idea to a physical product and understand the functions for like, customer satisfaction, returns, processing fees, like taking care of taxes, all of those things. Like I understand that conceptually. I am not a merchandising expert who understands like, the dyes, the different kind of like manufacturing timelines, understanding the materials and where you get screwed over on certain materials, understanding the complexities of certain types of manufacturing, certain types of garments. Like random example that I know from one of the companies I used to work in the private equity and we owned one of the companies that produced women's lingerie. I never knew that like women bra is ridiculously complex garment to produce. It's actually considered, I think, if the statement still stands, at least that's what the founder of that company used to tell me. Bra was the second most complex garment to produce next to the men's suit. Men's suit with all this complexity around, right? Like everything that goes into the jacket and everything goes into the pants. Women's bra is a single item, much smaller piece of, clothing was the second to it. And everything else was kind of like way behind. So like understanding those kind of things, understanding what it takes to produce that item is a required experience if you want to expand and take that kind of manufacturing internally. And for me, if they would come to me today, say before all this collapse, and they're like, "TohirT, what do you think? We're trying to bring manufacturing of our merchandise internally." The first question I would ask, who the heck on your team knows what it's going to take? And if none of you know and you just rely on third-party consultants who's going to drag out the project as long as possible because they want to charge you as many billable hours as possible, and if you don't understand all the complexity and intricacies of this business, keep hiring third-party. Go fan of a fan, go find someone else who is kind of like producing, right? Like go with fourth wall for all that matters at the very beginning, but just like find someone who really understands that, focus on the design and IP licensing, and gradually as that merchandising business grows, start thinking about, hey, can we go hire someone who's an expert in this and they become the leader of that merchandising department for us, right? So one of those things to keep in mind as a wearing thing, if you're like running a management company or you're on your creator team and you're considering something like this, it's just like, give me a call. Let's talk about it before you go and allocate hundreds of thousands of dollars for something like this. And talk about then strategic development of like thinking about how can use basically the data-driven product strategies, which I think all that it really means, we're going to look at the data and demographics of our viewers and understand what kind of products we need to release, probably as far as it goes, and diversified products, which is good. That's always a great idea. I always say the days of like, a cap and a hoodie and a t-shirt are well gone. You kind of like want to start producing something a lot more interesting, something a lot more relevant to the value that your content provides and your creative brand provides. So it makes sense for them to have the diverse products. So some interesting things, a lot of like negative signs, and not a lot, but some negative signs in terms of like seeing what they're doing wrong, and hopefully now you're understanding why this was a wrong decision. Now we are at the slide that tells a lot of the story and actually fed some of the news headlines about this business after it's collapsed. Yeah, I didn't really mention a lot, and I kind of like alluded to the fact that thing went wrong, but like VShojo at this point is it's gone. It's a non-existing brand. Someone probably owns the IP still, but one of the important things to lay the lay of the land. This is your kind of like more or less of a standard P&L, right? That you will see in a lot of corporations that they release. It's like nothing overly complex. Some of the things for you to know is that first, what it means is like when I say October 2024 forecast, it means that they're projecting, basically, they have the actuals through September and they're projecting Q4, October, November, December, and giving you the total number. So the total number over here is 3/4 real number, the actual dollar amounts that they made or spent, and then 3 months worth of projections based on their past data or some other indicators that they have. A few things to then talk about is that they have two forecasts. They call it like a moderate 2025 forecast and aggressive 2025 forecast. I'm going to jump in between. Just know that those are not actual numbers. This is just what they're forecasting. I want to primarily first focus on the 2024 just to talk a little bit about some of the red flags that I see. One of the ones at the very beginning, which is good, it's like sponsorship revenue. Hey, they have $2.2 million worth of sponsorship revenue based on brand deals. This is awesome. Merch revenue 1.4, which is kind of like different from 1.5 over there, but all good. Rounding probably up and down a few digits. Great. Remember when I said that from the perspective of IP licensing, those were all aspirational things. This is how I know it was aspirational things, because there's nothing here. There's no revenue in this bucket. So all of those like visuals of like, hey, we're gonna do the PC cases and whatnot, this was just an aspiration that they were planning to under the aggressive scenario. And then other revenue, something like 100K, which again, remember that shorter number for the Smite sponsorship? I think this is Smite. So it's about 100K or probably less, like 90 something K. So a total of $3.6 million in revenue, not bad. It's really good number, like especially if you're running a tight ship, small team, that's pretty good. Issues. 3.2 cogs. So based on the comments that I see over here, where they're talking about kind of like talent management and cogs, it's a lot of fees for the talent management, right? So essentially what you're telling me is that out of $3.6 million in revenue that you made, you had to pay out $3.2 million. Again, merchandising, not producing it internally, but they're probably including some cost of the merchandise. So like even throw out, I don't know, 1 million worth of dollars, maybe hopefully a lot less, maybe like 700K that it costs you to produce the merch, right? So your profit margin is about 50% on the gross level from merch. It's still over $2 million in talent management, right? And if you sponsorship revenue, say your talent managers are not getting paid on the merch, other revenue, who cares? It's too small. Say if it's even 2 million net of all the costs to produce the merchandise, so it's 2 million of costs of sponsorship that generated 2.2 million. You're paying your agents almost 100% fee. Like that did not make too much sense to me, unless what they're also doing here is that the sponsorship revenue is actually gross sponsorship revenue at the talent level. So that's 2.2 million is how much they made for their talent. And then they take out all the money that they're giving up to the talent, which is 80% probably, right? And then it's also on top of it, they go and have to go and pay their talent managers. So it's probably like 15%, which then start to make sense, right? Because if you take like 80 plus 15%, so you pay basically 95% of your total revenue back to the talent and the people who help you acquire those sponsorships, so your talent managers. So that's how you probably are left with like 200K worth of profit tops off of this number. And that's what would make sense from the perspective of the cogs of being about probably like 2 point change million, right? Probably like 2 million then, which again, then if it's 2 million, that would indicate that merch margin is terrible and they're paying pretty much as much and spending as much on merch as they're making in terms of the revenue. So like this whole dynamic is very lopsided. And which another kind of like clue to this is the fact that they talk about the fact that over here, where was it? Yeah, there we go. The gross margin improvement is driven by higher take rates and updated talent contracts. So basically what they're saying by this, we started charging our talent more. So probably it's not 80-20, it's like 70-30, 60-40, whatever they're taking from their talent in the updated contracts on the new IP licensing. These kind of also deals, if you're trying to update the contract with a higher take rate for your company, you're probably doing it on a smaller creators. I highly doubt you do it on someone like Iron Mouse, who's your leader, because you don't want to scare the top talent off by charging them higher fee. So you're very likely doing it on a smaller talent. You're not touching someone like Iron Mouse, which Iron Mouse is probably the biggest portion of your revenue. So that improvement to me kind of like starts becoming questionable, which again, you kind of see that where's their gross profit? Like it's not skyrocketing necessarily, right? Like in their gross profit, like moderate scenario, it only jumps up by like 100K on in a little bit of an increase, right? It's actually a decent increase, 1.2 million, right? Like 33% increase in their revenue, but their gross profit only comes up by like 20%, I guess, off of the 400K only, which to me tells me again that Iron Mouse is not touched here, and we're basically making higher percentage fee on a much smaller base of the revenue that we're making from the customers. And the reason why you see kind of like their forecast for the future and how they're like gross profit margin jumps to 2 million is because they're assuming that IP licensing revenue will be at a larger rate, but at the same time it kind of conflicts the whole thing that they're talking about 80-20 split, right? So there's something odd going on, or maybe not well thought through, not sync with the rest of the marketing slides that they had there. So again, you're burning through a ton of cash at that point. And then we go to SG&A. So sales general administration, right? That's the line item. Is basically, if you think about you have your revenue, you have your COGS, which is the cost for you to produce that revenue, right? So it's usually a cost of producing the product and those kind of things. But what you leave away is the salaries of all other employees, your rent for the office, your taxes, all that fun stuff. $1.9 million in salaries and payroll. And again, it's a pure speculation, TohirT speculation. That's probably a very high salary for those top 3 talent that they mentioned on the slide, which again, justifiable. They're very experienced individuals. But if you're running in this kind of like a startup-ish company, you don't take that much salary. You usually try to ingest as much as possible of that cash back into the company to help it grow. Even if you have talent managers who are hopefully getting paid mostly off of this, not off of this, but maybe they have higher bases, it's still a lot. You have 3 people plus, I said, 10 talent managers. So they have about 13 people overall. So if they have 13 people, on average, they're getting paid more than 100K. And you have people working out of Philippines and Japan, where, like, again, Japan, depending on where you are, if you're in Tokyo, it's pretty expensive. But, like, salaries are not necessarily directly comparable to the United States. And usually the top talent takes a little bit more. So I don't know. This was a mind-boggling number to me for the size of the company and the size of the revenue they're making. They're so bloated from the perspective of their payroll. And then you're talking about conferences, marketing, which is like nothing. Another OpEx, I don't know. Maybe that's probably, I don't even know what it is. Maybe office building or something like this. Or maybe it's the technology that they use to make the VTuber content. But to me, it's like, if someone brings this to me back in my days when I was like in venture capital and P and they says, would you invest in this? You better, you not only need to hit the aggressive scenario, you need to show me some long-term projections and how you're going to get there. You need to break it down line item by line item for me to even feel like confident enough to bring it back maybe to someone, to like my investment committee, to tell them like, hey, this is why I think it's a good idea. Like right now, this is to me bloated business that needs a lot of trimming, especially on the headcount side, and like rethinking of this structure to make sure you make a little bit more off of your sponsorship revenue. But you see this and then you realize like, okay, there were a lot of things going on wrong kind of like at the company. And from the other perspective, I'm kind of like ignore some of the other things. And again, projections, it's all aspirational, right? It's hard to tell. They can be real and pretty solid aspirations. But for these kind of things, I always say you need to have like line item prediction. If you're telling me you're going to make $2.3 million in licensing revenue, break it down for me by each company or each type of licensing. Break it down for me what needs to be made on the top side for those companies for us to get that portion of 2.3 million. And then also show me where in the pipeline, so to speak, in the sales pipeline, those companies are. To like, did we just grab a coffee with the someone at that company, some like, like a better word, some intern at that company, and they said it's going to be a good idea, they're going to bring it to the boss? Or we actually spoke with the founder, we had conversations, we're already drafting legal agreements, and we're doing those kind of things, right? Completely different than state of things in terms of how real that potential 2.3 million is. And this brings me to one of those interesting points that I've heard since then, right? It's easy to look at all of this and say, hey, they're bloated salaries, they paid themselves, they didn't care about their talent, and that's how it ended up being the fact that they didn't have money to pay the talent. The talent started leaving, including Iron Mouse, who basically was the first one to go public and essentially say, hey, VShojo is not paying me. This is a scam. I'm out. One hypothesis is that can be it's a scam. They just paid themselves and they enjoyed it. And they kind of like tried to make it last as long as possible until the cover was blown and then they ran for the hills. Sure. It's interesting that a few other creators, and again, this is he said, she said situation, a few other creators who are close to the founding company, who actually knew the background of what was happening at VShojo, told a little bit of a different story, which was not as like sexy for the headlines. But I think an important consideration if you're thinking about like creating a management company and doing something of this kind, positive, managing companies, not running away into the hills with the money. What they shared is essentially, it's not that they had some sort of like a malice, right? Out of malice that this happened. What happened here is that they just simply ran out of the lending strip to go and take off and kind of like make this business work. And how it usually happens, and I've seen it times and times again with the startups, is that you have an interesting idea, you have early success, you get some money, you raise some money to kind of like support this early success, you attract interesting talent, you attract folks who help you, start putting that aforementioned airplane, so to speak, getting ready to take it off. But then what's important is that you need to have a solid plan in place that is supported by the reality of things for you to at least, take off. Maybe you're gonna barely take off and you kind of like keep building that airplane as you're flying and you're improving and you keep it elevating further and up using that metaphor. And finally, you're like flying at the cruising altitude of 35,000 feet in the air, right? And you're successful and great. You're gonna achieve your destination, whatever the destination is. Many of these startups forget to actually plan for like what it's going to take us to take off. Like, do we need 20 other employees coding overnight for the next 3 years for this to happen? Or do we just need a couple of things to happen for it to be a reality? Depending on which scenario you're facing, the probability of you actually succeeding are very different. And unfortunately, I guess fortunately maybe for me and my career opportunities, this is a boring as heck type of work to do. It's not exciting, it's not as interesting. You just have to sit down and you have to like continuously draw out the charts of workflows. Here's how it's going to work, here's what we need, build up forecasts and projections and test them and test them and test them again, track the data, talk to people. It's like a lot of mundane rudimentary work, which honestly anyone can do, just people don't want to do it because it's not as exciting. But this is so critically important, because when you do this kind of work, you can very quickly and early realize as a founder of the company, oh crap, like I'm going to run out of runway here, right? Like I don't have enough cash to support my business for long enough to take off. Example here being, I think, and why, again, pure speculation. I don't know directly that team, but I think I lean towards agreeing that this is very likely what has happened, is that they very likely saw initial success. They got excited. They didn't think through the fact that, hey, a lot of these things need to happen in order for us to be able to keep feeding the machine. Because if you're burning $2.4 million every year while still making money, like if you don't have enough cash in the bank account, you won't have enough cash to pay to the creators who expect that. And I think that's literally what happened. They just bloated P&L, didn't think through how much revenue they need to make to support all of this. They just ran out of cash in the bank account. And the hope probably was, hey, we're going to get some of those licensing deals done early, not 2025 and 2024. And that money will be used to go pay our clients in our agency for their prior work. And that will hopefully give us time to invest into the next project. And that project will feed kind of like the fees that we'll owe by then to someone else. And then we're going to keep rolling it. And eventually we catch up to the point where our growth and revenue will be so high up that we no longer need to catch up and kind of like, take money of one pocket and use it to pay another pocket. It's going to be more like, hey, we have a sustainable now business, our revenue fully covers our expenses, and we'll have some profits. That's the ideal scenario, but you need to build there, you need to get there. And I think they just ran out of cash to do so. Why? Current economic climate. Like, I still love the creator economy. I'm still gonna love it for hopefully years to come. But one of those things that happened this year and starting actually end of last year is that economic uncertainty drove a lot of businesses to spend a lot less investing in the creators, investing in their marketing campaigns, doing those kind of things. People got a lot more financially conservative and no longer spend as much money on merch, on supporting their creators, on subscribing to their creators, right? So you see contraction on the revenue side. So I think if not for the current economy, and again, that's their fault for not predicting it, they didn't think through the worst case scenario. Everything in their plan needed to happen perfectly in order for this all to work, which is the worst place to be. Please, never. If you're building a business right now, if you're trying to strategize around what you're going to do in, say, the coming couple of years, unfortunately, in the current economic environment, you need to make sure if you're creating a sustainable creator business, you need the worst case scenario to be the one to support it. Never use best case scenario is the best case scenario. It's like this nice surprise that if it happened, oh, nice, it happened. Your entire business, ideally, in the current economic environment, should be supported off of your conservative scenario, which I usually recommend, like whatever your current average is minus 20% at least, right? Like, or 30%. Ideally, can you survive on the 50% of your current revenue? If you can maintain your business, you're going to be in great shape. If things go wrong and if you have a war chest, you're going to be in good shape for a long term, right? Again, aspirational. I understand it's not always reality. Sometimes we're kind of like almost like live a paycheck to paycheck in the creator space. But this is why it's important to predict those things. The lesson here is that think through those worst case scenarios. Don't assume the best, most aggressive scenario for you to just make the base break-even point work, right? If that's the case, you should go and really revisit your expenses and rethink your entire business model. But be conservative. The more conservative you are, the more thoughtful you are about what it's going to take for you to achieve different types of like moderate scenario and aggressive scenario, you can start thinking about how realistic it is and plan accordingly. So again, it's purely speculation. Could be the fact that it was all malice and they were like, hey, we know we're doing something wrong, but we're just going to keep paying ourselves hundreds of thousands of dollars in salaries because we know this show has a very short runway. It's going to all crumble and we're going to claim that we didn't know that this is going to happen. But based on some of the other things and some of the creators who've mentioned this, who I fully trust, it does sound like it was just folks got over their skis. They were great at something, which was thinking about the industry, thinking about how to produce content, creating that bridge between Japanese and North American content, but they were just not good operators and they didn't have a good operator on the team to help them think through some of those problems and kind of like raise red flags way early on to say like, guys, we're heading in the wrong direction. We need to like pause, reiterate, revisit all of our business structures before we can proceed. So unfortunately it did not happen, which resulted in creators not being paid, creators feeling like they got screwed over, their fans I'm sure also being affected. So an interesting lesson. Again, I hope you took away something from this. If you have any questions or if you have some opinions in terms of like what went wrong here, if you think I'm misreading certain situation, you have more information about it, reach out or drop them in the comment section below and I'll see you next Saturday. Peace.